Great. So, thank you. This actually sort of worked out well for me. I was scheduled to give this year a couple of months ago, but I had a little bit of an injury, like a number of prominent professional basketball players. I tore my Achilles tendon, and I've been in rehab and haven't been able to drive. So the Zoom allows me to participate as well. Now. That's funny since I really have not enjoyed the Zoom experience of giving shirim that much. I think I gave one in this context. I find it a bit frustrating, but in my office, I have three screens. So I can see my notes, I can see my PowerPoint, and I can see the people. And I'll just ask if you are in a reasonable state that you turn on your camera because it makes a big difference to be giving a class to people as opposed to big letters or images or names. So it makes it feel a little bit more like I have an audience, which makes a bit of a difference. The other point I'll make about a Zoom share is that it's a little bit complicated and challenging to manage questions. So I have made a few markers in my notes at certain times to stop and take questions. It would be easier if you would write them in the chat, and then I will stop every once in a while and take a look at those, and then we can manage that piece of it. Okay?
That's a good idea, but please also leave some time at the end in case someone wants, because I don't know if everyone is familiar with the chat.
Okay, fine. We will
Thank you.
try to do that. I will do my best to manage the time. Okay. Pursuing prophecy in a post-prophetic world. This is a topic or a collection of topics that's very dear to my heart, something I've spent some time on, both on the Machshevet Yisrael side and on the Tanakh side. And I want to frame this discussion in a very particular way that I guess begins with this unique pasuk in Sefer Yoel. The pasuk says, "V'haya achareichen eshpochet ruchi al kol basar, v'nib'u b'neichem uvnotechem ziknechem chalomot yachlomun, bachurechem chezyonot yir'u." The context of this nivuah is not necessarily relevant for us right now, which is kind of against my general principle that you should always know the context of a pasuk, but it is a vision for the future. And in this vision of the future, it suggests that there is a universal possibility or value to becoming a prophet. That somehow in some version of a future world, Hashem is going to grant prophecy to everybody. Now, that's a very significant and interesting idea. It might remind some people of the Midrash about what people, the Yotzei Mitzrayim, saw at Kriyat Yam Suf, comparing it to the visions of Yechezkel ben Buzi. But the idea that prophecy is somehow accessible to everybody and relevant to everyone, that is sort of the starting point of this discussion. But I want to frame it in a little bit of a different way. Machshevet Yisrael as a discipline talks about issues that are significant, important, have to do with sort of the fundamentals, especially if we think about the Rambam and the Yud Gimel Ikarim, the fundamentals of faith that relate to what makes Yahadut Yahadut, how the system works at some level. And in that context, the idea of prophecy is of primary importance. And this, to some degree, is where it makes its appearance on the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikarim. Why is prophecy central to Judaism? Well, obviously, because we believe that God is connected to the world, not only as the creator, but as is connected and could be connected to individuals. And the significance of that point is very much connected to understanding what where the prophets come from, but more importantly, where the Torah comes from. And for the Rambam, and I may have discussed this in a different context in this forum, and if not, that could be an upcoming shir. The significance of prophecy, and particularly the prophecy of Moshe, to help us understand the source of the Torah, That is a fundamental statement about Judaism. That's not really what I want to talk about, though. I want to talk about what prophecy is, how it is a potentially accessible category. And this will get us into the post-prophetic world element. And ultimately, why should you care? Because there's another element of Machshevet Yisrael that I think to some degree is underemphasized. At least it was when I was potentially teaching it in high school. I think Misrad HaChinuch has actually done a bit of a better job in the new version, even though it gets some bad press. The material for the Machshevet Yisrael Bagrut is actually quite well put together. But the significance of a Machshevet Yisrael concept as a prophecy is in, well, what does that mean? How does that help us understand what our own conception of Yahadut, and in this case, connection to Hashem could or should be? Now, from that point, I want to make a very important split, which should not be surprising that anyone that has heard me speak or understands a little bit about some of my interests. The difference between sort of the rational and the mystical thinking about prophecy. Prophecy as religious experience, as something that connects to the way we feel about Hashem, that leads to a kind of mystical approach. That is an entire area that I will not be addressing. Instead, I want to talk about, and this, of course, is rooted in the Rambam, and what we mean by what it means to be a rationalist, is that if prophecy is a concept in Yahadut, then it is a concept that I have at least some ability to understand, to deconstruct, to make real, to make practical in a way that makes sense. And our goal is to try to understand, starting with the Rambam and then with Rav Soloveitchik, to understand, well, what does prophecy actually mean? It's great. We read about it in the Tanakh. We understand there's prophets. We can accept that there were prophets that had a connection to God, that said something. We understand the messages of the prophets, at least some of them. We understand the value of those messages. But what is prophecy? Is it a real thing? Are we kidding ourselves here? Do we really think that prophecy is possible? And of course, probably not the first person to ask that question, but the first person to take it all the way to its logical extreme is, of course, the Rambam. And what we want to do now is talk about the Rambam's theory of prophecy, not his theory about why it's important. That's the prophecy of Moshe, the prophecy of the Torah, etc. But his theory about how prophecy works and why it's so significant that it works in this way. And for that, we're going to start with the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, as a interesting trivia aside, piquante piece of trivia, the Rambam speaks about prophecy in the second section of the Moreh Nevuchim from Prakim Lamed Bet through Memchet, that is from Lev to Moach. And that is where his focus, his description of prophecy resides. And the Rambam lays out for us three different views about what prophecy is. Okay, the opinions of people concerning prophecy. The first opinion, that of the multitude of those among the pagans who considered prophecy as true and also believed by some of the common people professing our law. Now, if the Rambam talks about multitude and common people, then presumably this is not the opinion that he agrees with, but this is the opinion. What is this opinion? That God may be exalted. All of these quotations, the Moreh Nevuchim, of course, are written in Arabic. These quotations are from the English translation, the Shlomo Pines edition. Is that God may be exalted, chooses whom he wishes from among men, turns him into a prophet, and sends him with a message. Okay, now, what does that mean? God just chooses someone, anyone. It almost doesn't matter. The point is that there doesn't need to be any particular qualities or characteristics to this person. As he goes on, according to them, makes no difference whether this individual is a man of knowledge or ignorant, aged or young. However, they also posit as a condition as him having a certain goodness or sound morality. Okay, so in general, God isn't going to choose a scoundrel. But there's no particular value to the personality of the prophet. In other words, prophecy is one directional. God has a need, so to speak, to communicate with the world. He chooses a messenger. That messenger delivers the message, end of story. It's a video call, it's a telephone call, it's a post-it note, whatever it is, it's a way of communicating a message. That's the first opinion, and that only addresses one side of prophecy, which is how does God connect to the world? The Rambam, of course, is not satisfied with that, but we'll get to his opinion. The second opinion about prophecy is that of the philosophers. It affirms that prophecy is a certain perfection in the nature of man. This perfection is not achieved in any individual from among men except after a training that makes that which exists in potentiality of the species pass into actuality. We're going to leave that sentence for a second, or we'll get back to it later. But the point is that the person who receives the prophecy is as important as the person that gives the prophecy, or as God who gives the prophecy. That person has a certain perfection. According to this opinion, it's not possible that an ignoramus should turn into a prophet, nor can a man not be a prophet on a certain evening and be a prophet on the following morning as though he had made some find. It doesn't happen. You don't stumble into prophecy. It is the culmination of a process and of a perfection, and we'll get back to that word in a minute. So these two extremes tell you, well, what's significant in the process of prophecy, or rather, how significant is the prophet? And the view of the philosophers, according to the Rambam, is that the prophet is of essential importance. It's not just any old vehicle for transmission, but it is the proper receptacle for the prophecy. And that leads the Rambam to his opinion. The third opinion is the opinion of our law and the foundation of our doctrine. It is identical with the philosophic opinion, except in one thing. In other words, the Rambam says, if the question is, can anyone be a prophet, or can only a particular personality be a prophet? The answer is very clearly, the prophet needs to be a particular type of personality. But there's one difference between what the Rambam thinks and what the philosophers think. For we believe that it may happen that one who is fit for prophecy and prepared for it should not become a prophet, namely on account of the divine will. That is to say, according to the philosopher's opinion, if you've done all the right things, if you are prophet worthy or prophecy worthy, you're a prophet. You will be getting prophecy. It's automatic. It is a natural process. There is nothing supernatural about prophecy. And on this point, the Rambam disagrees. No, says the Rambam, you might have done everything you needed to do, but still, there's a possibility that you won't get prophecy. In other words, the Rambam's, for the Rambam, prophecy works like this. Obviously, you need to be a worthy person. In order to be worthy, there's two words that he uses there that we'll talk about a little bit: perfection and training. You don't just stumble into being a prophecy. You're not chosen overnight. If someone, this, by the way, helps the Rambam explain, well, how do we know who a false prophet is? Well, we know who a prophet is. It's a personality. It's someone we know. It's someone who we would expect to have prophecy, not someone who walks in and says, God spoke to me last night. And the last point, which differentiates the Rambam from the philosophers, is that there's divine control, divine allowance. He goes on to say that it is miraculous. Not getting prophecy is a kind of miracle. God would have to hold you back from getting prophecy in the way that he performs other miracles. But of course, that's possible, and that's part of it. And what that does is that it ensures for the Rambam that God still controls the messaging. It's not only natural. The Rambam is choosing both sides. He is saying, on the one hand, I accept the philosophic opinion that prophecy needs to be a natural process. It needs to be something that I can explain, and we're going to do that very shortly. But prophecy is not only natural because it is a connection to the divine, it is a connection to God, and of course, God controls that connection. And that is not a secondary point, it is a primary point in understanding the value of prophecy. Okay, I am going to take a brief pause. I'm going to see if anyone has written anything in the chat. And I see that no one has. So I'm going to take that as a green light and move forward. That is step number one with the Rambam. But now, because our goal is to actually try to understand what the Rambam's theory of prophecy is, we're going to dive into it a little bit more deeply and understand the mechanics of the prophetic experience according to the Rambam. And it starts with his description of Nevuah in the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, Perek Zayin Halacha. And the Rambam writes as follows: Miyesodei hadat leida sha'el menaveet b'nei adam. It is a fundamental to accept that God speaks to people. God prophesies, he communicates with people. But the ein hanevuah chala el. Nevuah doesn't appear. You don't become a prophet except under the following three conditions. What are the three conditions that make the prophet? The Rambam describes them as follows. Number one, al chacham gadol b'chokhmah. Okay, you have to be wise. What does he mean by that? We'll come back to that in a minute. Number two, gibor b'midotav. And this he gives a little bit more color. What does he mean by a gibor b'midotav? Evoking Pirkei Avot, Ezehu gibor hakoveshet yitzro. It's about control. Lo yehe yitzro mitgaber alav b'davar ba'olam. You never give in to your desires. Elahu mitgaber bid'ato al yitzro tamid. You are always consciously in control. Okay, fine. That's number two. Why is that significant for prophecy? We will explain. And number three, V'hu ba'al de'a rechava nechona ad me'od. This is an unusual phrase. Ba'al de'a rechava. He has not chokhmah, right? In the first one, he talked about chokhmah. Here he talks about de'a. De'a rechava. Some sort of breadth of understanding, knowledge. We'll come back to it. Nechona ad ma'od. Extreme breadth. Okay, what does that mean? We're now going to explain those three things, but first we need to continue in the Rambam to not only understand the personality of the prophet, but also the content of prophecy. We're not going to get into this too deeply, but it's relevant for his description as he goes on. He says the following: Hadvarim shemodi'im l'navi b'marei nevuah. This is in Halacha Gimel, the same parak. And the things that the prophet sees, or the things that God shows the prophet through a prophetic vision, derech mashal modi'in lo. They are conveyed to the prophet through a parable. Umiyad yichakek b'libo pitron hamashal b'marei nevuah. That parable is a visual parable. It's a marei nevuah. But understand that the prophet doesn't only see the vision, the parable, but he also understands what it means. V'yedama, he understands it, he knows what it is. And then he gives examples, Kamo Asulam Shir'ah Yaakov Avinu, Malachim Olim V'yordim Bo, V'huaya Mashal Malchiyot V'shibudin. In this case, the Rambam explains not only the vision, but also the meaning of it, the ladder of Yaakov, Kamo Achayot Shir'ah Yechezkel, when in Yechezkel's vision of Maseh Merkavah, the animals that he sees pulling the Merkavah. V'hasir nafuch u'makala shakei shir'ah Yirmiyahu. In the first parak of Yirmiyahu, he sees those visions that teach him that the enemy is coming from the north. Hamegillah shir'ah Yechezkel, that he eats and begins his prophecy. V'haifa shir'ah Zechariah, and his difficult prophecies at the beginning of Sefer Zechariah. So we understand from the record of prophecy that we have in Sifrei Nevuah that this is the way prophecy works. It works through visions, through images. We'll come back to that. And of course, we understand that Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy did not work in that way, and that's connected to what we read recently in Parshat Balotcha. We're not going to get into those details. Okay, so what do we have? Three characteristics of a prophet: Chacham Gadol, Gibor B'midotav, and Baal De'ah Rechava Ad Ma'od. What do these three things mean? And why are they critical for a prophet, in order for a prophet to receive prophecy, in order for a prophet to reach that state where it is appropriate or likely that he can receive prophecy, and why should we care about it? Well, we basically have these three things: wise, he says, very moral, heroically moral, and bal de'arach hava. What do we mean by that at all? So to round out what the Rambam means, we will go back to the Moreh Nevuchim and fill in some of the details that he is referencing in his rather short comments in the Mishnah Torah. In back to chapter 32, Lamed Bet, in the second section of the Moreh Nevuchim, when the Rambam talks about the second opinion of the philosophers, the part that we didn't focus on says the following. He says, things are rather as follows, when he says you don't just get a nevuah, but things rather are as follows. When in the case of a superior individual who is perfect with respect to his rational and moral qualities, okay, so that is wise and moral, number 1 and 2. And the Rambam uses the word perfect in regard to those two qualities or virtues: perfect rational knowledge, perfect moral qualities. We'll explain those even further. But then the Rambam gives a different description of this third quality. Here he says, his imaginative faculty is in its most perfect state. That is to say, Baal De'arach Hava, for the Rambam, means imagination. Why imagination? We're going to get to that in a second. We're going to take it one by one. First, we're going to clarify more carefully why the Rambam cares about perfection when it comes to rational qualities and moral qualities. Well, understand that for the Rambam, these perfections relate to what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a perfect or a realized human being. And this takes us to the very last chapter in the Moreh Nevuchim. In that chapter, the Rambam says as follows. The ancient and the modern philosophers have made it clear that the perfection is to be found in man. Now remember, in this world, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, when the Rambam thinks about the world, about creation, about other creatures, and about human beings, what he believes in is that a human being created by God has an ultimate purpose, an ultimate form. And that ultimate form is the perfection of that form, and that is what we should be striving for. And he says that when it comes to human beings, there are 4 types of perfections. The first is the perfection of possessions, that would be wealth. The second is the perfection of bodily constitutions and shape, that would be physical strength and physical health. Okay, the Rambam has a few things to say about those things. They are very explicitly, for the Rambam, not the most important things. The third is the perfection of the moral virtues. It consists in the individual's moral habits having attained their ultimate excellence. Most of the commandments serve no other end than the attainment of this species of perfection. Moral perfection means making rational decisions, choosing to do the right thing under, again, as the Rambam described in his in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Mishnah Torah. Where did I lost that? Gibor b'midotav lo yehe yitzro mitgaber alav b'davar bo'olam. You never make an irrational choice. You never make a non-conscious choice. You never give in to the situation. Instead, you have perfect moral habits. Now, the Rambam thought that was possible. We can discuss a little bit how we think about that. But the Rambam certainly believed that the strength, the greatness of the human being is in his ability to make decisions, to make conscious decisions, to choose how to behave under any and all circumstances. That's a perfection. And the fourth consists in the acquisition of the rational virtues I refer to conception of intelligibles, which teach true opinions concerning divine things. The Rambam believed in truth with a capital T. There is a truth. It exists. It exists actually outside of you. And that connects to one of the metaphors that he and other philosophers give for truth. It exists in the world around you. You just need to shine the light on it. It exists there. And not only does it exist, but you, a human being, are capable of understanding it and understanding all of it. Now, what is it? What is included in the body of knowledge that the Rambam thought was possible to acquire? Well, he talks about intelligibles and divine things. what he refers to as metaphysics, certainly, but you understand what it is possible to understand about God and his world. That is intellectual perfection. That is a prerequisite for becoming a prophet. What does this mean? Well, the Rambam thinks that in order to become a prophet, you as a person need to realize your ultimate goal and destiny and perfection. And that means two things. Number one, you know all the things that there are to know, fundamentally, primarily about God and his world. But whatever it is, there's a finite source of information, which perhaps we might think is very hard to understand, especially given our access to information and misinformation online. But the Rambam thought that the amount of knowledge that was accessible and valuable was known, it was bounded, and it was your, at some sense, responsibility to understand everything. And secondly, he thinks that when it comes to moral qualities, if you understand the purpose of most of the mitzvot, and you make conscious and rational and correct decisions in all circumstances, then you have achieved a certain moral perfection. And once you've achieved that perfection, then you are ready to become a prophet, except for one other thing. You need imagination. What does the Rambam mean by imagination, and why is it relevant to this discussion? The Rambam explains what he means by imagination in a number of places. The most basic is in the Shmona Prakim, his introduction to Pirkei Avot, when he describes the nefesh adam, the parts of a person, of the human personality or soul, and he includes in that, or mind, and he includes in that the imaginative quality. What does it mean to have imagination? Right? We use that word in all sorts of different ways, but the Rambam says as following: Hu hakoach asher yiskor rishumei hamuchashim asher he'elmam mikirvat hachushim asher hesigu. Okay, imagination is the ability to reconstruct or remember things which you have perceived with your senses. I saw a tree, I close my eyes, I can imagine a tree. And obviously things more complicated than that. V'yarkiv k'tzatam min k'tzatam. But imagination does more than recall sensory image. It can also combine sensory image. V'yafrid k'tzatam min k'tzatam. And also deconstruct sensory images, pull them apart, understand components. Leficha, yarkiv ze hakoach min hadvarim asher esigum, dvarim shelo esigum klal. And this is closer to what we understand about imagination. Imagining the ability to mix and match sensory experience is what allows human beings to construct, to imagine things that have never existed. And this is really the main reason why I bring the source. It's just so clever and historically significant, because the Rambam gives an example of the kind of thing that you can imagine, but is, of course, impossible. And the first example is, Kamo she'yadameh adam sfinat barzel ratza ba'avir. The idea of a flying boat is, of course, inconceivable and unimaginable. And the only reason why we understand such a thing is because of our imagination. We have a concept of a boat and we have a concept of flying. We put them together and we imagine the impossible thing that is, of course, an airplane. And there's one flying overhead right now. That's the Rambam's description of imagination. He gives, of course, some other examples. So obviously, there's other sources in the Rambam to support this, but I'm going to summarize and move on. The three characteristics of a prophet are not really about characteristics, they are about perfections. And what the Rambam expects of the prophet, of the prophetic personality, is number one, perfect knowledge. He knows everything that it is possible to know. Number two, perfect behavior control. He is morally perfect. He doesn't make bad choices. And finally, number three, he has perfect imagination. Now, why do you need these three things in order to get a prophecy? How does this help the Rambam move from this mysterious idea of prophecy, of God's connection to the world, which seems impossible, to a rational description of what prophecy is? Well, it works like this. He describes it in chapter 36 of the Mor Nevuchim as follows. Know that the true reality and quiddity of prophecy consists in it being an overflow, overflowing from God. That is the important word that the Rambam uses, the shefa, this flow from God. What does that mean? Through the intermediation of the active intellect toward the rational faculty in the first place, and thereafter towards the imaginative faculty. We're not going to get lost in this concept of the active intellect, which the Rambam believes in and is discussed in medieval philosophy, but it relates to what we talked about in terms of knowledge. There was this belief that knowledge is actually all God's knowledge. When you know something, what you know is something about God's world. That's a way of knowing God. Or the body of knowledge, we can call the active intellect. This is everything that God knows. And when you understand something, what's happening is a light is being shined on knowledge that exists. Now, the reason why this is important, it relates to the Rambam's theory that you can know everything because there's a finite amount of knowledge. It is one of the ways in which God is connected to the world. And when that knowledge sort of overflows, what does that mean? Towards the rational faculty and then to the imaginative faculty. This, I'm continuing in the second paragraph, is the highest degree of man and the ultimate term of perfection that can exist for his species. This state is the ultimate term of perfection for the imaginative faculty. This is not something that can exist in any man. And I want to read the last paragraph, make one point, and then I'm going to tell the whole story, so to speak. It is not something that can be attained solely through perfections in the speculative sciences and through improvement of moral habits, right? Those are things you can work at. You can get better. You can realize your intellectual capabilities by studying. You can realize your moral strength through practice and focus. Even if all of them have become fine as good as can be, there still is needed, in addition to the highest possible degree of perfection of the imaginative faculty, in respect to its original disposition. Okay, I don't want to get lost in the sources here. The Rambam makes a very important statement. He says you need imagination, and he also says that imagination is something that you're born with. You either have it or you don't. In our own we understand that some people are more imaginative than others. The Rambam thinks that is a gift, a God-given gift. Now, what does this mean? What is the story of prophecy according to the Rambam now that we understand these three pieces? Pieces 1 and 2, intellectual and moral virtue. Piece number 3, imagination, which is a natural proclivity, a natural talent given to you. Okay, I'm going to add one more piece, and then we're going to bring it all together. The Rambam, in his third section of the Moreh Nevuchim, talks about the purpose of mitzvot. And he has this statement, he makes this statement in variations in a number of different places. And the statement is basically this. The law, the Torah as a whole, aims at two things: the welfare of the soul and the welfare of the body. The purpose of all mitzvot in the Torah is one of two things: either to teach you how to behave or to teach you what is true. And sometimes both. Good. Now, why do I say these things? Let's tell the whole story. Who is the prophet? The prophet is the perfect, realized human, or let's say Ben Torah, right? The purpose of the Torah, of learning the Torah, is so that you understand what is true and what is right. You need to know what is the reality, that is the rational faculties, what is the truth of God's world and his place in it, number one. Number two, you need to behave. You need to be in control so that you are always choosing your divine side and not your animal side. You are always making a rational choice. You're always in control. And most of the mitzvot of the Torah are in order to help us to be able to manage that side of us. Those are the two things that the human being can perfect. And if you perfect those things and you were gifted an imagination, something amazing can happen, and it works like this. The Rambam believes, and he talks about this in Shmona Prakim and also in the Moreh Nevuchim, that a dream, right, the imagination is in control when you dream. What happens when you dream? Well, we all know when you dream, it takes the things, right? What does he say the characteristics of the imaginative faculty are? That it takes your experiences and it combines them in all sorts of ways. So when we have dreams, we dream about people that we know and places that we've been, and it's all mixed up and jumbled together in fantastical and incomprehensible ways. But the Rambam believes that's just a hint of what the imaginative faculty is and could be. Because the Rambam thinks like this: if you know everything, which again, he thinks is possible. If you know everything, which means your mind is filled with truth and only truth. He talks to other about if your mind is filled with other things, then you'll be a false prophet. But if your mind is full in truth, and then what's the point of the moral virtue? The point of moral virtue is because it's a distraction. When we give in to our desires, when we're tempted, when we are drawn to certain things, it pulls us down. I think the basic way of saying it for the Rambam is it turns, right? A person is a rational animal. And when you give in to your desires and you're not in complete moral control, you are still a little bit animal and you're not divine. But if you are as divine as humanly possible, which means you don't get distracted at all by human frailty, and you are filled only with truth, then what does your imagination do? It takes those truths and it combines them and visualizes them in a way for you, which is prophecy. It is a divine communication. That's the process of prophecy. The Rambam takes things that are in theory, though in practice maybe not, in theory accessible. The imagination is a thing. We all know what it is. We understand how the imagination works beyond our control and combines things. And the Rambam says, well, how does this work? Well, if your head is only filled with the truth, and you're not distracted by things that aren't the truth and by animalistic qualities of humanity, then when your imagination works on those truths, what will happen is they will combine into new truths, truths that are beyond what you thought you knew. That is a prophetic experience for the Rambam. Okay, now remember the Rambam says, but God controls that spigot. He doesn't open that shefa all the time. And that's where and by the way, the Rambam thinks that sometimes you might get a prophecy and the prophecy is only for you to understand. And sometimes that prophecy is a mission to go to the Jewish people and give a particular mission. Now, I don't want to get lost in that part of it because I want to move on, but I want to summarize it like this. The Rambam does a amazing thing, something that at some level is maybe a little bit hard to swallow, but I want to understand sort of the pieces of it, and I would understand the overall focus and purpose of what the Rambam is doing. The Rambam says in his Igeret Tchiyat HaMetim that his goal is to understand Judaism as much as possible. He acknowledges that there are limits, but he doesn't say, oh, prophecy, an amazing thing, connection to God, that's mystical, that's wonderful, the end of story. No, he says, if this is a thing, it's a real thing. If it's a real thing, I can understand it. If not totally, then at least mostly. And not only that, in my understanding of this thing, I will get to the heart of what it means to be human and what the purpose of the Torah is. His concept of prophecy basically says, if you follow the Torah as it is meant to be, then what you are doing is perfecting yourself morally and intellectually and making yourself an appropriate vessel to receive God's wisdom in a way that is beyond what you would get in the normal or normal intellectual pursuit. That's the Rambam's position. And ultimately, what the Rambam does for us is he sets a perhaps unattainable, but very high standards. The Rambam believes in humanity, the strength of humanity, the divinity of humanity. And this is, I think, sort of the ultimate statement of what being a prophet means for the Rambam. And we're going to talk about the implications, starting with Rav Soloveitchik's interpretation of the Rambam and his own extension to it. But I'm going to take another stop and see if we have any questions. Okay, Edith asks about the prophecy of Yosef in the Rambam's view. The Rambam lists levels of prophecy. Yosef did not have prophecy. Yosef had a dream. Why was his dream not a real prophecy and only a dream? I think I don't remember exactly what the Rambam says or if he relates specifically to that, but based on my understanding of the Rambam, I would say that it's pretty clear. Because the Rambam says that when you're a prophet, you don't only get the vision, you know what it means. And the basic issue with Yosef's dream is that he was slightly off in what he thought the dream meant at the beginning, and then maybe over time he came to understand what it means, not that he was going to lord over his brothers, but that he was going to protect them. That's obviously for a different story. But for the Rambam, a dream that is not, and he has this whole description in the Moreh Nevuchim second section about different levels, etc. Manoach and his wife, I think he relates to directly, but it is a question, right? Because the idea that just someone gets prophecy, that's not just an idea. That's an idea that is kind of embedded in the Tanakh. The Rambam needs to deal with Manoach. Bilam is less of a problem because the Rambam can believe that even a non-Jew can achieve this type of perfection. But certainly there are some questions from the Rambam, from the details of the Tanakh. As he says in another context, the gates of interpretation are open. So I don't think any of them would bother the Rambam in particular. But the value of his position is that as this all-encompassing theory, how it answers all details is, of course, a question. Again, some of them he relates to directly that I don't recall, and some of them are just implied or not addressed directly. Okay, good. So let's now transition from the Rambam to Rav Soloveitchik. I'm going to be talking about Rav Soloveitchik's work Uvikashta Misham, which is found in this book, Ish Halacha Galui V'Nistar. The first half of the book is Ish Halacha, halachic man, probably more well known. The second half of the book is Uvikashta Misham, which was translated into English a number of years ago. And we're going to talk about the Rav Soloveitchik's theory as it comes out of this book. And also, I guess I'll say that, well, what I did to the Rambam wasn't fair either, because there's a lot of more sources that I skipped over and summarized. But what I'm going to do to Rav Soloveitchik is really not fair, because I'm going to try to summarize this whole book in less than 15 minutes, or at least the key component stuff. Okay. The Rav Soloveitchik does a very interesting thing. He quotes the Rambam. He explains it in a very particular way. I want to talk about Rav Soloveitchik as a parshan on the Rambam, and then I want to talk briefly about his theory. Now I'm reading from page 217. Lefi hashkafat harambam, chipus ha'elohim v'itkonenut musarit likrato chashuvim ma'od. And now that we've learned the Rambam, we understand why he uses the word musarit here. Okay, emet. Ha'el minabed b'nei ha'adam, as the Rambam wrote, umizdakek lahem, is connected because Rav Soloveitchik very much cares about the connection between God and man, which is, of course, at the core of the prophetic experience. Aval ha'adam sarich levakesh et ha'elohim ulhachin et atzmo likrato. Now, this is pshat in the Rambam. The Rambam says it explicitly, right? It's not pshat in the Tanakh necessarily, though the Rambam finds some hints to it, but it's pshat in the Rambam. There is no such thing as a prophet who didn't prepare for his prophecy. You don't just get prophecy. Okay? Fine. So far, Rav Soloveitchik is explaining the Rambam. The Rambam says you need to prepare for prophecy, and he's already mentioned you need to prepare morally, not only intellectually. So, what is that preparation? Sarich adam litaher ulekadesh et atzmo al yedei ma'amatz seichel veratzon. Intellectual and moral effort. Straight from the Rambam. Ve'al yedei alilot yotzrot ukvirot totzaot. The Rav Soloveitchik adds this element of productive creativity. We'll get to that in a minute, but he adds this little twist to it. He does not mention imagination. That's a whole other story, but I think it's embedded there, but we're not going to talk about it. Kedei liot muchan lishmo dvar Hashem. And then Rav Soloveitchik says an amazing thing. What was implied in the Rambam, Rav Soloveitchik says explicitly. Yeshna mitzvah achat hakolelet et kol taryag hamitzvot v'hi mitzvat kedoshim tiyu. Okay. That's actually from the Ramban. There's a general mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu, and it, for Rav Soloveitchik, captures at some level the entire Torah. What is it? And this is the Chiddush. Shehi b'mahuta mitzvat hachana l'nevuah. The Rambam does an amazing, Rav Soloveitchik does an amazing thing here, connect it to the Rambam, bringing it all together. He says Kedoshim Tiyu is a general mitzvah. And the actual realization of this mitzvah is the expectation that everybody, it's a mitzvah, prepares to be a Navi. That is the mitzvah, to prepare to be a Navi. And we already know, because we just saw the Rambam, how is that mitzvah? How does that mitzvah encompass all of the other mitzvot? Because the Rambam says, right, the purpose of mitzvot is intellectual virtue and moral virtue. And if you know those mitzvot, if you've done all those things, then you are, at some level, inevitably prepared to be a Navi. However, I want to go on in Rav Soloveitchik because he takes it another step, and it is both a step beyond the Rambam, but is also a step, I think, a little bit closer to our experience. And he does this by adjusting some of the expectations of the Rambam and taking it further. Part of the issue, remember, the Rambam says that you could do all these things and you still won't be a prophet. And in practice, basically, unless maybe there's a world in which the Rambam might have thought that he might have had some prophecy, right? There is no prophecy since the close of the Tanakh. So what are we talking about? So Rav Soloveitchik takes on that issue with this idea of the continuity of prophecy. And what does it mean? Lo rak hanavi be'atzmo masiget milui ga'aguav v'chisufav lihidabek be'Eloah. It is not limited to the prophets of the Tanakh, the ability to connect to God. Ela kol echad v'echad miYisrael yachol gashem et she'ifato leElohim al yedei ishtavut b'soret hanevuit. You, every individual, every member of Klal Yisrael, has the ability to fulfill this desire of connection to God. How? By connecting to the prophetic tradition that already exists. Mahi, hanevuah ina rak tofat ha'avar b'divrei yameinu. It's not just recorded prophetic prophecies in the Tanakh. Hagilui ha'historia chad pami maveh toda'ah chaya v'hemshechit shel gilui Elohim. The recorded prophecy, in particular, the prophecy of the Torah, continues. It is embedded in the human experience. Gilui Elohim hu chazon nitzchi hashat bezerem hazman uveshetef hadorot. The revelation of God is embedded into humanity. Miyom shegila Elohim et atzmo al adam adayin lo nastem hachazon, lo nistam hachazon, ve'Elohim lo alam mi'alav. The gates of prophecy are still open. This is the way the Rambam says this. Now, in order to explain this point, I am going to do, again, the most completely unfair and inappropriate thing and summarize the Vikashta Misham in one slide. Read the book, you should. Number one, the Rambam has a theory in his book, Uvikashta Misham. Unfairly simplistic summary of Uvikashta Misham. Number one, humanity searches for God in the natural world. What does Rav Soloveitchik mean by that? We've all been inspired. We've been inspired by people. We've been inspired by nature. We've been inspired by events. Whenever we are inspired, that is a glimpse of the divine. When we strive towards the divine, that is a connection to God. That is the unending, he puts all of culture into this basket, the unending search. The fact that human beings search, what that means for the Rambam, even in all of its secular and modern attempts, it is at its core a search for God. However, that search fails. What does that mean? It fails. It doesn't reach fulfillment. It leads to disappointment, because when we look for inspiration in people, we find disappointment. When we look for inspiration in nature, we find tragedy. The natural world is a stepping stone towards the divine, but it is also a dead end. This is Rav Soloveitchik's premise at the beginning of the book, what he calls the Bereshit model, and that leads him to the counterbalance, which is revelation, nivuah. But Rav Soloveitchik focused on Nevuah by focusing on Har Sinai and the premise of Kafa Alehem Har Kigigit, which tells us that divine presence in this world is overwhelming, imposing, and in contrast to what we thought. We search for inspiration, we search for meaning in the world, we run into a dead end, and then we are presented with Torah and mitzvot. How do Torah and mitzvot answer the question of meaning in the world? Laws and expectations. How is that the pathway towards divine connection? And here, not very far under the surface, the Rav Soloveitchik is directly addressing the challenge to halachic and rabbinic Judaism that says you're missing the point. Torah, halacha, that's not godly. That's minutia. And the Rambam and Rav Soloveitchik acknowledges that. I keep saying Rambam and Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik acknowledges this. He's like, at first glance, you're right. But there is the final stage of dveikut, which is a synthesis of these two things. And how does that happen? Well, he says the following. There's three ways in which we can get to dveikut when we run into the dead end of the natural search for God and are confused and overwhelmed by the halakhic search for God. And Rav Soloveitchik says the following: Bishlosha drachim mitbatei shifat hayadut la'alot et hatoda'a lidargat toda'a ruchani. There's three paths. Hamachaberet et hashiva tiv'it, the natural inclination, right? That first search, the Breshit search, shel Adam Elohim, and emunato giluyit, the presentation of the Torah at Sinai. What are those three paths? Number one, shilton haseichel. Not perfection of the seichel, but shilton haseichel. I'll explain it briefly. Number two, halat haguf. Not exactly perfection, moral perfection, bahala, right? This elevation. And finally, hatmadat devar Elohim. What does Rav Soloveitchik mean by these things? If the Rambam talked about perfection, and he said the prophetic personality is the human being who has achieved perfection in all possible areas. Number one, their inborn talent of imagination. Number two, they know everything that needs to be known. And number two, they are also in control, and they are completely on the rational as opposed to the animal side. Rav Soloveitchik adds a twist in all of these three things. The first is creativity and learning Torah. The Rambam doesn't talk, Rav Soloveitchik doesn't talk about perfection. He talks about creativity. What's creativity? When you understand the Torah to such a degree, right, that you can create, that you can not only be inspired broadly, but your whole inspirational focus is on understanding Dvar Hashem. If you reach a moment of creativity, not necessarily a lifetime of perfection, though I think it takes at least part of a lifetime to get to the point where your creativity is based, that's we're not going to get to now. That moment of creativity, that is Shilton HaSeichel. And elevating the physical through mitzvot, yes, it is important. Rav Soloveitchik doesn't necessarily say you don't need to always be in control. But what he talks about is the value of this control and how the Torah, the mitzvot in the Torah, particularly the mitzvot around controlling eating and sexual desires, are a way of bringing God, bringing the divine into the human. If for the Rambam, probably there's this sense that you need to overcome your humanity in order to connect to the divine. Rav Soloveitchik believes that you can redeem, that's a word he uses all the time, you can redeem your humanity. You can have a sudat mitzvah so that your eating is directed directionally towards God. And that's the elevation of the physical. And those two things lead to the continuity of the prophetic experience. And we go back to this. What does Rav Soloveitchik say? Preparing for prophecy, ultimately, for Rav Soloveitchik and the Rambam, means understanding the purpose of the Torah. If you understand the purpose of the Torah, then you understand that you are focusing your intellectual powers and your need for inspiration in the world of the Torah. You are understanding that mitzvot are not a divine imposition, but they are a way to connect this mundane world with through your behavior to the divine.
Power
If you
box.
do those two things,
Probably.
it's not a third thing, right? these three, creativity and learning Torah, elevating the physical through mitzvot, does not just, then there's not a third team of continuity of prophecy. The continuity of the prophetic experience is those two things. They are the very same thing, because that means that now when I learn Torah and do mitzvot, I do it from the perspective of one who understands. I'm not overwhelmed by Sinai, but I'm a partner in it. I'm not overwhelmed by the details of the mitzvot, but I am mechadesh. I innovate, I'm creative, I understand what they mean. I see, and this is the heroic, I see that the controlling elements of mitzvot are things that raise me up and make me divine and ready for prophecy. So, if the Rambam took the prophet and transformed the idea of prophecy from a messenger to the ideal Jew, someone who understands Torah mitzvot, and he put it in a direction of perfection, then Rav Soloveitchik riffs or expands or slightly moves from the Rambam and makes the claim that the elements are the same. It's intellectual and it's moral. It's how you understand those two things and how you integrate your own understanding of Torah into the pre-existing prophetic corpus, namely the Torah. When you invest your own personality in Torah and mitzvot, then that is the dveikut, that is the prophetic experience that we are striving for. And again, it is the ultimate purpose of mitzvot. So what we've said, this is grand theory of Torah and mitzvot that says connection to God, which is prophecy, is not different from the world of Torah mitzvot that we understand. They are connected. Torah mitzvot are a vehicle. This comes from the Rambam, and Rav Soloveitchik sort of takes it another level, and it pushes us to see the personality of prophet and the idea of prophecy not as recorded history in the Tanakh, but as a overarching framework within which we see the purpose of Torah and mitzvot that allows us to balance this striving and for inspiration and connection to God with the details of mitzvot and the content of the Torah. Okay. Thank you. Chat. Okay, so someone asked about Yirmiyahu. The answer for the Rambam is very easy, because the part that Yirmiyahu was chosen, that would be his imagination, and then obviously Yirmiyahu would have to be slightly older than maybe some Parshanim in order to have fulfilled the other elements. Did the Rambam see himself as having received prophecy? He never says that, but he does occasionally say, "I just got a wild idea." So you tell me. Okay, anyone want to ask a question as we wrap up? Okay, thank you very much. Hope that went well. I must say that speaking to myself on Zoom is slightly less satisfying than being in a room with all of you, and I hope that I'm healed and the situation allows us to get together at some point in the near future.
Amen. Thank you.
What did he say after?